When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Scum YouTube channel. Today's video, we are going to be talking about the first Blackfyre Rebellion. This is going to be a series very similar to my Robert's Rebellion series, except it's going to be a little different. My problem with the first Blackfyre Rebellion, given that we don't have as structured of a timeline of things that happened, I think it's easier to kind of build out the characters that form the first Blackfyre Rebellion because they all paint a certain picture. Whereas unlike Robert's Rebellion, I think, you know, yes, there is a number of reasons why it started. It's a little bit more simple to understand. The first Blackfyre Rebellion is an event that is not like Robert's Rebellion in a lot of ways. It's a lot more built upon cultures that dislike each other. It's about, you know, rumors going on about things that, you know, divide, and you have two sides. The first Blackfyre Rebellion is a lot more similar to the Dance of the Dragons than it is to Robert's Rebellion. And so I think the way to cover this subject is to start from Daeron the Young Dragon. I think you can go to a number of spots and point to where the first Blackfyre Rebellion really starts, but I find that Daeron the First Targaryen is an interesting character to study, right? It's someone that Aegon IV looked up to. A lot of the issues we're going to see with the Dornish and the rest of Westeros is going to stem from this conflict, but also other conflicts that happened in the past. So I think this is the perfect time to look at the conquest of Dorne and its effects on all of our characters, leading to certain characters getting together, certain characters like Aegon IV wanting to invade Dorne, why he had such a hatred towards his own son. All of that will kind of be talked about in this video. But before we get into it, if you did want to become a Patreon or a member, you do get videos early and an exclusive video each week on House of the Dragon for the episode. Those are where my episode reviews go. But let's get into the video. So Daeron Targaryen is the character we're really going to focus on in this video. When I say Daeron Targaryen, I mean the young dragon. I don't mean Daeron the Daring of the Dance. I don't mean Daeron II in terms of Aegon's son. I'm talking about Daeron I. So I want to get that clear into your guys' minds. This is not the character of Daeron during the dance. I think we need to start much earlier before we get to that point for it to all kind of make sense, in my opinion. So Daeron was born in 143 AC as the firstborn son and heir of King Aegon III Targaryen and Queen Daenerys Velaryon, a very prominent figure in Daenerys. But Daenerys will come back to when we get to kind of Aegon's story and a little bit into Baelor's story, but Queen Daenerys would be eventually the mother of Daemon Blackfyre, a very interesting woman that we're going to study in the future. But his father would die only 14 years after his birth. And when he takes the throne, he is only 14 years of age. Very similar to a character like Robb Stark, and their ends are actually very similar as well. Daeron Targaryen was someone that many people looked up to. He was someone that was trying to, you know, finish what the Targaryens started, taking Dorne. That was something that he looked upon as being the main issue of his reign. And I've criticized Daeron quite a lot because I think his actions lead to a lot of unnecessary violence and death for basically nothing. He gains nothing out of the conflict that's going to happen in the conquest of Dorne, and it also just makes relations with Dorne even more hostile. It has those relations with the rest of Westeros against the Martells and against Dorne. They get to their highest because of Daeron. Let's kind of go through the conquest of Dorne. I'm not going to go through it, you know, specifically every little detail because this series is not about the conquest of Dorne. But it's about why this event is so polarizing. What was the importance of it and all of that? Just like Daeron's relative Aegon the Conqueror, he decided to try to take out Dorne. Well, how does he do this, right? Similarly, he has two armies invade into Dorne through the passes, whether that be through the Prince's Pass or the Bone Way using goat tracks, which is eventually what Daeron uses. And eventually these passes would prove to be pretty useful. And there was two prominent figures leading these armies. You had Daeron himself, but also Lionel Tyrell. Very important figure as well, as he has a pretty dark end. And so at this time, Westeros is quite united against the Dornish. We know from the main story, Doran Martell even notes this when he talks about Daeron's work about the conquest of Dorne. They vastly outnumbered the Dornish. And so the Dornish, when they get into these battles, their strength withers away. And even within a year, and one of the big problems that Aegon did not use during his first trying of getting his first attempt at the conquest of Dorne, is he didn't really use the navy to really impact the way the Dornish were allowed to move around and all of that, because he actually had Lord Alan Velaryon, who had come up through the Green Blood, also taking out the Blanky Town. They more or less were able to divide the Dornish and were able to defeat them. And within that year, the Targaryen armies arrived at the gates of Sunspear, and they battled their way through the Shadow City. And in 158 AC, the Prince of Dorne and 40 of the most powerful Dornish lords bent their knees in submission of Sunspear, with all 7 kingdoms now ruled by the Iron Throne, in fact, as well as name. So at this point, this is a really big moment, right? Because there was never at any point in Aegon's conquest of Dorne where Dorne was actually conquered, right? There never was that point, right? The Targaryens believed that they conquered the Dornish, but they never really did, right? There was no formal actual bending of the knee that occurred during that time. And so this is a huge feat to start off Daeron's reign, right? He's taken out Dorne in a pretty quick amount of time and did it much more efficiently than Aegon did. But this would prove to be not fruitful. Because as soon as Aegon would leave, very similar to certain things that happened during the Dornish conquests in the past, Dorne would rise up. As soon as Aegon leaves, there would be keeps here and there, all of which were, just being in rebellion, being in protest. And based upon what actually ends up happening, because you have a couple things happening at the same time, you have Lionel Tyrell, who is left in Dorne to keep the peace, but also think about who was actually with Daeron Targaryen. And even more interesting is that Prince Aegon Targaryen, or other known as Aegon IV, who was a bit older than Daeron, but was at kind of an age with him. He was only 7 years older, I believe, or maybe I think it was 8 years actually, that he was older than King Daeron. And so Daeron has Prince Aegon take all these hostages back to King's Landing and all of that. And so at this point, it seems like Dornish has been taken, right? All these hostages have been given to King's Landing to make sure they're, kept in line and all of that. You have your forces occupying Dorne to make sure they stay in line. And what is this going to do, right? Think about the hostilities that's going to occur, because not only did you, put somebody in charge basically to keep the peace over them, you put a Tyrell. And the Tyrells and Dornish have very bad relations given the constant warring that's happened. And that's really important to understand as we go forward, because remember, the Dornish are going to be a massive supporter of Baelor and Daeron II's side during the first Blackfyre Rebellion. Tracing all of this is key to this. Figuring out what happens because of this conquest is very important. But like I talked about, Lord Lionel Tyrell would find really no peace within Dorne. It seemed every day, or at least a lot of times, he'd be moving from this place to that, putting down rebellions, but eventually this was taxing, right? Rebels would attack his lines, more or less, taking out supplies or stealing them, killing soldiers or horses that were unaware of their presence, and burning camps. It gives you this feeling that Lionel Tyrell would have never felt truly safe. He would have probably been a very paranoid individual and stressed out beyond anything. You're trying to more or less fight people on their own terrain. It gives off a lot of vibes of like Vietnam or Korea, where the Americans, came in trying to stop communism and all these things and preventing it. But they're fighting on the home ground of these people. These people have more to fight for, and they know the land better than you. And that's really what we're kind of getting in this situation in terms of Tyrell's trying to put down the Dornish. And you got to think, right? All of these things is going to make the Dornish feel worse and worse and worse, right? Those hostilities are going to continue. When you see the Tyrells just moving through with this army, taking out town by town, the growing resentment is going to continue. Where eventually you're going to get to a point where, what do these people have to lose, right? That's a dangerous, dangerous mindset for a people. What do they have to lose? The French Revolution is almost completely backed upon that. When the people are going through such harsh conditions, they lash out. And that's kind of the way I feel kind of about what's going on in Dorne at this time as well. But Lionel reached the worst of the rebellion when they reached the seat of House Corgel. I hope I said that right. I feel like I didn't. But it was his custom to turn the lord of the keeps he stayed in out of their chambers to sleep in their beds. Again, not only is Lionel kind of putting down and killing all these Dornish people, invading their land, and we understand why he's doing that. He's trying to, have peace in this realm. That's what Daeron has tasked him with doing. But then you go into other people's, castles, halls, and make them leave their own beds. It's the disrespect. It's the way that there is this clear kind of discrimination or racism against the Dornish that occurs. We see it all throughout the first Blackfyre Rebellion. Aegon IV, he's going to learn all these things, right? Imagine being in a camp with people like Lionel Tyrell, the way that that's going to impact a very young man like Aegon Targaryen. And we know Aegon Targaryen, his mother was not a huge figure in his life, and he seemed to have a very strained relationship with his father. Think about what this is going to do, right? We know that Aegon's main role model or influence, who he's very influenced by, was Daeron Targaryen. And think about his second in command, really, in his invasion, is Lionel Tyrell. This is the way he treats people. And so what ends up happening is House Corgel flips on them. That night at Sandstone, he found himself in a bed with a heavy velvet canopy and was informed that he could summon a wench by pulling on the sash. Think about the way this is set up. Lionel comes in just using everyone and having no regard or respect for anything. And so they use this as a trap. When he did so, pulling on the sash, the canopy opened, and 100 red scorpions fell upon him. The news of his death led to a rebellion throughout Dorne, and in a fortnight, all the work of the young dragon was undone. And this is the whole problem, right? How do you get a people to follow you if you don't respect their culture, you don't respect them as a people? It's the exact reason why when Aegon Targaryen conquered, he tried to integrate into their society, right? Making a banner, making, this sigil, and having house words. All that stuff is very Westerosi. That's not really from Essos at all. They don't do that type of stuff. Aegon made sure that he was not viewed as so much of an outsider. Yes, he was an outsider really coming to take over, but he wanted to integrate into their culture and keep all those things, make it not a drastic change from one type of governance to the next. And the Targaryens didn't really do that at all. They blatantly did not like the Dornish. They tried to destroy their customs, all these things, and that's why the Dornish never were able to have like this peace under the Targaryens until they married into them. They saw that equality, right? Of, okay, you guys are willing to make our line, or at least a Dornish, be on the throne, right? With your Targaryen. That's equality. And that's the only reason why that we actually end up seeing the Dornish coming into the realm was because of that. They finally got shown some respect. That's something that they hadn't gotten in this conquest of Dorne, and which is why it needs to start out with this conflict specifically. But at the time also, Daeron was kind of making other mistakes. He had intended to wed one of his sisters to the Sea Lord of Braavos, but unfortunately for him, Braavos was already at a war with Pentos and Lys, and so it turned Pentos and Lys kind of against the Iron Throne already. And so you kind of are creating more enemies and allowing people that are going to sympathize with the Dornish. If you look at a real-world example, the French and the British did not like each other. So when the United States goes to war and is trying to break away from the British, they gain an ally from the French. One of the main reasons that America even gets its independence is because of the French. So that's kind of similar here, where it's like, okay, I don't like the Iron Throne because they're backing Braavos, who we're against if we're Pentos and Lys. And okay, well, the Dornish is against the Targaryens and King's Landing and Westeros. So we're going to help Dorne to do a little bit of a proxy war type situation. That's what was kind of going on here. And Daeron, unfortunately, decides to return to Dorne in 160 AC, only about 2 years after he had entered Dorne the first time. Again, the same plan seemed to work. There were several victories fighting through the Bone Way. Lord Alan Velaryon once more descended on the Planky Town in the Green Blood, but it still just wasn't enough, right? And even we know, this is one of the most fascinating parts, is a character known as Rickon Stark, the heir to Winterfell, died during the battle outside of Sunspear. But another year passes, and the Dornishmen agreed to meet to discuss terms and renew their fealty. But that was not the truth of it. We see a similar situation to the Red Wedding, or if we even want to go off House of the Dragon, the show where Daemon's waving this surrender flag or this peace banner. The white flag is supposed to symbolize, okay, we're going to stop warring. And that's more or less what the Dornish did. And yes, it might have been an underhanded tactic, and this is a reason why so many people dislike the Dornish. They viewed the Dornish as cowards. They viewed the Dornish as killing their beloved king. Remember, Daeron is a very popular king in Westeros. Jon and Robb are still heavily motivated by the stories of characters like Daeron and Aemon Targaryen. So when we look at to this point where you have this betrayal, where they meet and three of Daeron's Kingsguard are killed, Aemon is captured, and Daeron himself is killed. Well, you have the same reputation of, for instance, like the Freys in the normal story. Everybody views the Freys as being cowards and being scum and awful people. That's the way the Dornish are viewed. And you can try to rationalize what they did, you know, for better or worse. But it comes down to the fact that it comes down to like what Tywin says to Tyrion, right? Is it better to kill, you know, a dozen men at dinner or to have wars where thousands of men are going to die? And that's the way I think the Dornish looked at it. And so with Daeron's passing, a crown then went to his brother. It ends up going to Baelor. Now, Daeron Targaryen's body was returned to the Iron Throne, which was kind of seen as maybe a way to end the war, maybe, because you have Baelor, a new king, becoming the king. It seems like these conquests of Dorne have been very much detrimental. We have a number that at least 40,000 men probably died during this war. Not a good sign. It's why I put Daeron very low, usually in my rankings of the kings, of the Targaryens. He did a lot of carnage for very little gain and actually was quite detrimental to the Targaryen dynasty. Baelor, however, desired peace with Dorne. He tried to make a remedy of it. He walked the Bone Way barefoot to Sunspear, returning the hostages, and at the Dornish capital, he spoke with the Prince of Dorne and negotiated a betrothal between his cousin, Prince Daeron Targaryen, and the eldest child of the Prince of Dorne, Princess Miria Martell, as part of the peace negotiations. So this is where the war ends, for the most part, right? We don't really see any more fighting with the Dornish outside of certain things that are going to happen in the future. But what is important to understand with this whole situation, if you are a mother, if you're a wife, and you have all these men die, you know, you're 40,000 men is quite a lot, especially in the South. It's going to affect the South much more than it is like the North or, say, the Vale or like the Lannisters, for instance. It's going to affect the Reach and the Stormlands heavy because those were going to be the ones, again, supplying a lot of the army for Daeron. And so when you take this situation where, you know, you've had fight after fight after fight, conflict after conflict, think about it. There's been Vulture Kings and all this stuff. Even Jaehaerys and his sons had to put down this Dornish rebellion before it even really started. So you're sitting here in a situation where Dornish and Westeros have clashed numerous times now. It gets to that point where you get to a situation where it's the Blackwoods and the Brackens. You have so much hatred towards the other side. And it goes on, it just continues through generation and generation. Aegon IV would have saw this firsthand, right? He was someone that was learning and kind of growing underneath Daeron during the conquest of Dorne. He would have picked up on all of these things. He would have wanted to continue out the legacy of his biggest role model, Daeron Targaryen. And so the key part of this is, and we get to the point where the Dornish, if you're thinking about this from a logical point of view, right? If you look at the line of succession, the line was, okay, if Baelor has any children, you know, of course the line may go through that way. Well, Baelor being the way he is, the Dornish might have speculated he wasn't going to have any children. Well, then the line would have gone to Viserys. Well, Viserys was, at this time, again, you're starting your next line, right? You have Aegon's line and then Viserys' line. Viserys then was getting kind of older. Now, again, he should have ruled for quite a while. So, regardless, if you are the Dornish, you could have speculated that Aegon was a good bet. Because Aegon starts out in the line of succession extremely low. And he just gets closer and closer and closer until he's thrust into a position where he was never supposed to be king. He was never trained really to be king, and he was not a good person to be king, but he ends up doing so. And so where I want to finish this video is that exact point. With this, the Dornish were putting themselves in a great position to possibly have have their princess as the queen of all of Westeros with Daeron Targaryen II. And that's where we end the video. Because when we come back to this series, we're going to talk about Viserys, Aegon, and Daenerys, as they will all be massive characters going forward. As this opening part was to establish the relationship between the Dornish and the rest of Westeros, and why that will be such a dividing factor in the years to come. But thank you guys all for watching this first video of the series. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.